Matt Walsh was a guest on the Joe Rogan Experience, and he got to experience the exquisite pleasure of a live fact check. Let's see how he does with it, starting off with his claim.
How many people have had this done?
Depends on what. I don't think we have exact numbers, but it's, if we're talking about the drugs, it's, I mean, millions.
You're talking about hormone blockers? Yeah. Millions of kids have been on hormone blockers, really?
I'm sure someone's going to fact check me on that, but my guess is that we're into the millions now at this point. Yeah, that would be my guess. I can say for double mastectomies, I read a report recently that there were over 1,000 done between 2016 and 2019, and when you compare that to how many were done between 2008 and 2015, it's a massive increase. And over 1,000 girls had gender affirming double mastectomies in that time frame.
And when you say girls, you're talking about prepubescent,
right? Minors, and that's just up until 2019. And then we know that there's been this exponential increase with all this stuff year over year. So it's a lot. It's too many. Having this happen to one kid is way too many. It's a lot more than one.
Okay, so you don't necessarily expect on the Joe Rogan podcast to hear a lot of fact checks, but I love that. We haven't gotten the fact check yet. We're about to. Joe Rogan was actually asking follow-up questions. Like, he didn't really believe the numbers he was hearing. He was suspicious. He was actually thinking critically about it. I was very impressed by it, actually. And you can already tell what shaky ground Matt Walsh is on when he says, is it really in the millions? And Matt Walsh is like, well, someone's probably gonna fact check me, but I guess it's in the millions. And I would just say, for someone who definitely thinks he's an intellectual, shouldn't you fact check it? Like, before you go on other shows and make claims about it, before you make documentaries about it? Shouldn't it not be your guess that it's in the millions? Shouldn't it be a fact that you verified? Shouldn't your position on what should happen be informed by what has actually happened? Shouldn't the facts come first and your opinion on it come second? That is clearly not what happened, and I don't need to speculate anymore because it's gonna be very clear starting this clip.
I actually think that this shouldn't be happening to.
It's a very small number, if that's right.
It says over the last 5 years, there were at least 4,780 adolescents who started puberty blockers and had a prior gender dysphoria diagnosis.
This says it's kind of undercounted, but that
would be a big undercounting.
Less than 1,000 people a year.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would guess, hundreds of thousands at this, but I could be wrong.
Million sounds great.
Yeah, I could be wrong.
Yeah.
The Media Matters will have fun with that clip.
Yeah.
Matt Walsh claims it was.
Yeah, so they will. Have you considered asking yourself why? Why will Media Matters have fun with the clip of you guessing it's in the millions, learning it's in the thousands, and then in response to that, guessing it's in the 100,000? Well, you don't get to guess that it's in the hundreds of thousands. You already guessed. You guessed it was in the millions. You were dead wrong, hundreds and hundreds of times wrong. And that doesn't seem to bother you literally at all. It barely seems to bother Joe Rogan, who, again, credit to him and his team for doing the live fact checking. That's good. But why doesn't it bother Matt Walsh that he was off by so much, literally hundreds of times wrong? He's just moving on with his life. This topic that he has talked about endlessly for a couple of years, he didn't care enough to actually look up the numbers before doing hundreds of shows on it or before making a documentary about it. And when he is exposed to the actual information, he finds it to be irrelevant. He's just moving on with his life, Bridget.
Yeah, I mean, my question is like, where did he think he was going when he got in his car and went to that interview, that he wouldn't have these numbers ready? He wouldn't have looked them up, and that he's just basing it on his best guess when he finds out that best guess is completely wrong, not just a little bit wrong, but completely wrong. It's just like, well, I would still guess in the millions. You don't know what you're talking about. Matt Walsh is not a doctor. He doesn't have the basic stats correct. Maybe this is somebody who shouldn't be continuously platformed to spew nonsense about something that, by his own admission, he does not know what he's talking about. Like, it boggles the mind.
Yeah, and by the way, devil's advocate, you can say, well, thousands is just bad. It shouldn't happen to the thousands. Okay, that's fine. You could have activists who That's the only thing that they care about, even though it's 1,000 people a year in a country that has hundreds of millions of people. But it becomes very weird when a guy who hosts ostensibly a political news show only talks about something that affects maybe 1,000 people a year. And I'm not the one who has to convince you that it would be weird. He obviously believes that, which is why he lies and says it's millions. If you believe that it's millions, then maybe it makes sense that a guy will make his entire career based on this. If it's in the thousands, then that's very weird. And we now have, by the way, an answer to why when I tweeted that it's weird that Matt Walsh has to lie and pretend that he cares this much about the trans community just to make sure that tax levels on the rich stay low, he actually responded. And I know now why he was so sensitive to that, because it is an act. He doesn't even care enough about this to look up the numbers. He has no idea what's actually going on. He does know, though, that it gets his base riled up. And so if he talks about this, then they'll stay conservative or whatever. Again, he doesn't care enough to actually look into it, which is why it's easy for me to make the case that that's not actually what his end goal in politics is. That's not why he wants Republican politicians to be elected. There is something else, and I would argue it's something that actually affects these wealthy people. They don't want to pay taxes. They don't want government money to go to help the poor. They're not interested in that, but they can't run on that. That's not popular. The anti-trans stuff, that gets a lot of conservatives worked up.
That's such a good point. Like, because why else wouldn't he have just looked up that? If he knew he was gonna go on Joe Rogan's show and talk about this, he would have looked up that stat. The only reason to not look it up, but then still try to erroneously cite it, is if you really don't care about any of this. It's all just a game. You're saying this because you know it gets folks riled up for some other reason. That's such a good point.
Yeah, as Alex Shields points out, he was literally off by a factor of 1,000. Imagine if all I did was climate change stories. And in the end, the elevation of the temperature like globally was 1/1000th what I thought it was going to be. And I was just like, well, it doesn't matter, we're still gonna do it. Like, wouldn't that seem weird? Wouldn't that seem weird to you? But again, if it was all a grift, maybe not so weird. Anyway, by the way, super fast before we move on, you can see the actual numbers. So it's 633 puberty, and by the way, it's not puberty blockers. This is still being framed. It's puberty delaying medications. That's what it actually is. Now look, that's some people, but in a country of 340 million people or whatever it is, it's not super significant. Isn't it weird then that this is the only thing their politicians and media figures talk about? Doesn't that seem a little bit weird to you?
Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.